Much of the south is staying dry until after dark, and that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Tonight on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now today I'll be bringing you all the latest from Westminster. We'll explore what Beergate really means and has Sir Keir Starmer been telling the truth. We'll also explore the Northern Ireland election results and that Victory Day parade in Moscow. What's Putin up to? It's all to come on The Briefing.
A very good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date today on GB News. Russia's president claims the West was preparing to invade his land, and that's why he chose to invade Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made the comments as Moscow is holding its annual military parade to celebrate victory in World War II. Well, speaking this morning, the UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says the Kremlin's trying to intimidate other countries during its celebrations today. Overnight, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Moscow was imitating the Nazis. The Labour Party leader Sir Keir Starmer has pulled out of a keynote speech today. The withdrawal comes amid the ongoing allegations that he broke COVID rules in April of last year. Well, Durham police are investigating the event in question. Labour have denied that any rules were broken and have not said why Sir Keir has pulled out of the speech. Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis will meet party leaders at Stormont later today to press for the return of devolved government. It follows Sinn Féin's historic result in the Assembly elections, which saw them secure 27 seats and the DUP win 25. The Prime Minister says Britain's town centres will be given a new lease of life, with derelict shopfronts being transformed. The idea is to help restore neighbourhood pride. The plans are going to be announced in the Queen's speech during the state opening of Parliament tomorrow. The Prime Minister says the plans will give councils extra powers as well to force landlords to rent out empty shops. You're up to date. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's head back to The Briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, as the dust was settling on a mixed bag of local elections, perhaps an even more significant piece of news dropped. The Telegraph reported that Sir Keir Starmer was under police investigation over his lockdown curry social. The police then confirmed this scoop, leaving many to wonder if this would have been made public at all on Friday if it weren't for some good, honest, investigative journalism. New evidence, the police confirmed, had come to light surrounding the event on the 30th of April 2021, when, as with the 19th of June 2020 event for which the Prime Minister and Chancellor received their fixed penalty notices, indoor socialising was against the rules. Evidence, including 30 people in attendance, the fact that the deputy leader of the Labour Party was there too, despite Labour's earlier denials, the fact that Starmer's hotel was serving food at the time, and the timing of the footage late at night coming to light, too have raised some big questions and inconsistencies in the Labour Party's account. Let's remember that despite what Labour has continually claimed, Durham Police has not until now investigated this event at all. They had simply reviewed a video of it, concluding an investigation was initially not necessary. Well, now the event is being investigated for the first time, and there are some big questions to answer, particularly now that we know the dinner was a pre-planned event, thanks to this internal Labour Party op note obtained by the Mail on Sunday. The note, which highlights the state of national lockdown at the time, lists a Zoom call followed by a separate dinner lasting around an hour and a half to take place in Miners Hall with Durham MP Mary Foy and, of course, the Labour leader. The dinner was scheduled to start after Sir Keir left his Zoom call, and there are no further items on the agenda after it. This is a note that confirms the last scheduled event of the day was a curry and beer with the campaigning team after a long day of work. After the dinner, it simply lists a short walk back to the hotel and confirms the end of the visit. But in recent weeks, as Sir Keir has tried to explain this event, he's given a very different impression. He's said that people simply got hungry and ordered a takeaway while they worked. He said they returned to work after eating. Let's take a listen.
We're in the office, working in the office, and we stopped for a takeaway, and then we carried on working, and that is the long and the short of it. We were in the office to do that work. At some point, this was in the evening, everybody's hungry, and a takeaway was ordered. It was then delivered into the kitchen of the offices.
Well, it sounds very much like a birthday cake at an event where people were working, which is exactly what the Prime Minister
in Durham, all
has
restaurants
said.
and pubs were closed, so takeaways were really the only way you could eat. So this was brought in, and at various points, people went through the kitchen, got a plate, had something to eat, and got on with their work.
Well, we now know that is at best misleading. The curry and drinks were pre-planned, and there was no work listed for afterwards. Someone who attended the event and is willing to speak to the police this morning told the Politico Playbook newsletter that, quote, there was no work being done. There just wasn't. The Zoom events had finished. It wasn't work, and there was no work after that I was aware of. Well, this morning Sir Keir has cancelled a speaking event, which included a Q&A. And over the weekend, Labour tasked Lord Faulkner with constructing a legal defence for the party. He'll have to argue that the curry and beers were necessary for the purposes of campaigning. This is a story that is just getting started. Well, joining me now to discuss this further and the political implications of it is Dan Hodges, commentator at The Mail on Sunday. Dan, thanks for your time this morning. This is the most extraordinary story that seems to get more extraordinary with every new revelation. Where are the Labour Party left this morning?
Well, the Labour Party are left in a mess, as evidenced by the fact that their leader has had to suddenly pull out of a major speech that was scheduled for this morning. And obviously, as we saw on the media round yesterday, the Labour Party has still got no coherent answer to the questions that have been thrown up by the release of the memo. The Labour Party still has no coherent answer to the fundamental question of how Keir Starmer's event differs from the events that they've been criticising, and obviously, most crucially, the event where Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were fined merely for eating a piece of cake. And the other area where it's quite clear Labour are in a mess is nobody within the Labour Party is able to give a clear answer on whether they believe Keir Starmer should resign if fined, when Keir Starmer himself and many of his shadow cabinet colleagues called on Boris to resign simply because of the fact that Boris was being investigated. And obviously, as we now know, Keir is being investigated himself.
It does rather strike me that this whole conversation has reached this level of ridiculosity, really, because of Labour's initial response to Partygate. If Sir Keir had not been so puritanical on the issue of whether or not someone's subject to investigation, they must resign, or on the issue of asking or demanding that Rishi Sunak resign for his ludicrous fixed penalty notice, I think many people in Westminster can see that Rishi Sunak did not think he had done anything wrong, and that was an incredibly strict interpretation of the rules that landed him with a fixed penalty notice. I suppose Sir Keir Starmer might be in a better position now had he not called for Rishi Sunak to resign.
Well, yes, but I think the issue is there are three separate problems for Labour with this. The first one is obviously on the issue of whether Starmer has broken the criminal law. We'll have to wait for the police investigation. But certainly, and contrary to what some high-profile legal commentators were saying over the weekend, it is quite clear now that because Durham police have reopened the investigation, the police themselves very clearly see there is at a minimum a case to be answered here. Then we've obviously got the issue of what is basically the lying that the Labour Party have been doing on this issue, from when they were telling us Angela Rayner wasn't present at the event to when they finally admitted she was, to the fact, as we've seen in those clips, where Keir Starmer consistently has pretended the meal and the curry were some sort of impromptu that the meal was some sort of impromptu decision taken whilst they were working, whilst we now know it was pre-planned. And obviously on this crucial issue about where Keir Starmer has consistently said that they stopped working, had their meal, and then went back to work. Now, the memo is very clear that wasn't in the schedule. I mean, obviously, I've spoken to an eyewitness. It's been reported in other newspapers, and eyewitnesses said categorically that they didn't go back to work. But then the final thing, as you pointed out, is obviously the hypocrisy. You know, we had a situation where Keir Starmer has consistently, not just on this issue but other issues, banged on again and again and again about Boris's need to be open, to be trustworthy, to be transparent, to demonstrate integrity, about the need for that across our politics. He's built it, if you like, into his leadership model. But we've got the situation this morning, the incredible situation where the Labour Party are still effectively trying to say that Boris Johnson and other politicians should adhere to the very high standards that Keir Starmer sets, but that Keir Starmer should not be held to the very high standards that Keir Starmer sets. And that's quite clearly a completely unsustainable political position.
The problem here, potentially, for the Conservative MPs that might sort of privately be delighting in this whole situation, is that people are less likely to believe that Sir Keir Starmer is someone who would want to go to a party in the first place. Simply the impression that we have of him as an individual in our sort of collective minds is that he's a fairly stern individual, whereas Boris Johnson is someone who likes fun more. So it's much easier on less evidence to think that Boris Johnson was probably partying, whereas Sir Keir Starmer, sort of almost the definition of a party, is something that Sir Keir Starmer is not at.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to be honest. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, we've obviously seen the videos. Whatever this event was, I'm not entirely sure I would characterise having a curry and a beer in those offices at 10 o'clock at night, is particularly my idea of a wild party. I mean, I think throughout this is one of the problems. We've got fixated on this issue of, was event X a party, was event Y a party? That's not the issue. The issue is, was the event necessary for work purposes during the period of lockdown when people were supposed to be self-isolating? And it is increasingly clear on the evidence we have that this event was not necessary. Now, again, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, may have a defence. They may have a rationale for what happened, but it's quite clear the defence they've been setting out over the last weeks and months has basically been blown apart by the release of this memo and the witness statements to ourselves at the Mail on Sunday and other newspapers. So instead of hiding, as he's done today, Keir Starmer is going to have to come out, face the press, and finally be honest and upfront and clear up precisely what happened, as much as anything else, because he's got to appear in the House of Commons tomorrow because it's the Queen's speech.
Certainly some big questions to answer, and this does feel like the beginning of a rather large story rather than the end of it. Well, thank you for joining us this morning, Dan Hodges, and talking through that really important story there. Cheers.
Thank you.
Now, today marks the 9th of May. That marks, of course, the day after VE Day, or the day of VE Day if you are in Russia. So Russia commemorates today the defeat of Germany and the expansion of Soviet rule across Eastern Europe. Celebrations in Moscow are well underway as Russia celebrates that 1945 victory over Nazi Germany, showing their military might despite ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and perhaps less might than everyone had thought. The Russian president began his speech in Moscow by telling the Russian troops they're defending their own country in Ukraine. Well, let's make sense of this all now with Keir Giles, Russia expert at Chatham House. Welcome to the programme. We've heard Vladimir Putin speak this morning, making the most extraordinary allegations of Western aggression. What was he saying?
Well, a lot of people were getting very excited ahead of Vladimir Putin's speech, thinking that he would have to say something about the way the war was going in Ukraine. There were all kinds of predictions ranging from declaring victory to actually declaring war on Ukraine, because as far as Russia is concerned, there isn't a war. Putin is just calling it a special military operation. But the key thing about all of those predictions is they were all coming from the West. They were coming from analysts and commentators who were predicting confidently what Putin would say, but none of it was actually driven by what Russia itself was saying. And instead, we've heard the same old story from Putin now. We've heard that, yes, Russia is surrounded by enemies, it's under siege, it's under attack, and everything that Russia is doing is actually a defensive response to attacks from the West and from Ukraine itself. It's just a symptom of this alternative reality that has been driven by Russian propaganda for so long now that it's very hard to challenge within Russia itself. It's only outside the country that discordant note between what Putin is saying and what the rest of the world knows to be true is clear.
Looking at the events today, there was a flypast that was cancelled. There are fewer tanks, there are fewer elements of the army than there were last year out and about. Does this show a slightly weaker Russia, potentially?
There's always a lot of tea leaf reading that goes into exactly what's been put into the parade. And yes, it's not surprising that a slightly different makeup for the parade reflects how much of Russia's forces are actually engaged in Ukraine at the moment. But cancelling a flypast because of the weather, we shouldn't necessarily dig too deep and read too much into that. It could simply be a straightforward sequence of events that is not related to what's happening in Ukraine. It's far more what Putin is saying and how he's framing this event that is of interest. And of course, it's part of that ongoing narrative of Russia against the world, of Russia being on the defensive and having to prosecute this war of reconquest in Europe because it's forced to do so.
Do Vladimir Putin's words today suggest that this is a conflict that will stretch on much further than this month? Of course, many people suggesting that it could have all been wrapped up today. That now seems like a fantasy.
That's exactly that. That was one of the predictions, that if Putin declared that some of the objectives of Russia in Ukraine had been met, then it would have meant that they could have a ceasefire, a scaling down of military operations. But that hasn't happened. So yes, Russia does seem to be in this for the long haul, but at the same time, Putin did not announce many of the steps that Russia would actually need to take to conduct this war for much longer, like a military call-up in order to replace the manpower that it's losing in Ukraine and keep those frontline units manned. So yes, there's a mixture there of both this apparent determination to continue with the conflict, but also still not to admit that Russia is actually waging war against its neighbor.
So how does this all conclude then? If Russia's not going to declare formal war, not going to have the boost of troops that would provide, how does Ukraine conclude?
Well, that's because they haven't formally announced that they're going to be calling up more troops. Doesn't necessarily mean that mobilization isn't happening. You can see Russia scraping the barrel for manpower in a lot of different regions. This forced mobilization of people in the occupied regions of Ukraine to fight on the Russian side, which in itself is just one of the many war crimes that Russia is currently conducting. Recruiting in Syria, recruiting private military companies, mercenaries, all in an attempt to keep this war effort going without declaring the full-scale mobilization of Russia that would be necessary to actually completely overwhelm Ukraine. So yes, this will drag on, and it remains the case that the biggest challenge for the West is to support Ukraine as that front line of defense of Europe against these Russian wars of reconquest. That's why it's so urgent to continue the military help to Ukraine, but also the humanitarian and the economic aid that's necessary to keep Ukraine functioning as a state while it's under this devastating attack across the whole of the country by Russian long-range strikes.
Well, it is such a fascinating ongoing situation, and one that it seems like the West is not the best at predicting how it will go in the future. Well, let's hope that conversation has made more sense of it for everyone listening at home. Thank you so much for joining us, Keir Giles, of course, Russia expert at Chatham House. Thank you for your time this morning. Now, yesterday it became official. Irish nationalist Republican outfit Sinn Féin became the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly. The Sinn Féin won 27 seats, 2 ahead of the DUP on 25. Cross-Community Alliance Party was third on 17, while the Ulster Unionist Party won 9 and left-wing SDLP won 8. So what will the consequence of this election be? And will we now see a Sinn Féin First Minister? Well, joining me now from Stormont to discuss the outcome of these elections is our Northern Ireland reporter, Doogie Beattie. Doogie, talk us through what happened.
Well, I mean, you and I spoke about this back in January, and we said that Sinn Féin would come back as the largest party, but they left here with 27 seats. They came back with 27 seats. We also said that the DUP weren't as badly wounded as people were predicting. They weren't. They lost 3 seats. One of those was Alex Easton, who was an ex-party member who stood as an independent. That did happen, but it's all about the mismanagement of the vote, and you and I spoke about that as well. There is quotas everywhere, North, East Antrim and Strangford. The DUP should have had 4 in each of these. They only brought back 3. And of course, we also said that the Alliance Party would take votes off nationalism. Nationalism vote is actually down. Unionist votes have split and fragmented, and now we are looking at Stormont with pretty much going back into a zombie government.
A zombie government, what a prospect. Well, Doogie, thank you for talking us through those results there briefly. Really appreciate your time this morning. Well, we can now speak to Emma Little-Pengelly, a barrister and, of course, also former DUP MP, of course. Welcome to the programme. I suppose there is a big symbolism to Sinn Féin coming first, despite the fact that the unionist vote fractured. Does that change things in Northern Ireland?
Well, there is a huge symbolism, and this is something that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson and the DUP warned very strongly of. It had been very clear, as Dougie has indicated there, that the unionist vote was fracturing, particularly around the issue of the protocol. So what we've seen is that the DUP have lost votes towards a harder line party to the right of the DUP, the TUV, very, very strongly anti-protocol party, but also anti-power sharing. And Sir Geoffrey Donaldson could see that that was happening. He tried to stem that flow, and I think to a certain extent successfully, in that he only dropped 3 seats, I said there, but actually they'd already lost 1 to the independents. So went into the election with 27 seats, came out with 25. However, it has been very, very close between Sinn Féin and the DUP for some years now. What Sinn Féin has really done is consolidated the nationalist vote. So they have grown in terms of votes, not in terms of seats, but they were able to hold on to their 27 by taking votes from another nationalist party, the SDLP. And effectively then that meant that when the DUP dropped their 2 or 3 seats, they're now in the position to take the First Minister position. But I think importantly, as Dougie has said, there's been a lot of spin about this. So Jeffrey Donaldson said Sinn Féin would spin this to try to say, oh, this is a momentum towards Irish unity. We need to have a referendum. But in fact, the nationalist bloc of Sinn Féin and SDLP actually dropped more seats than the unionist bloc, and indeed actually remain the second largest designation. Unionism is still the largest designation. And their vote hasn't changed. The percentage of that nationalist vote hasn't changed from 1998, that first election after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So there are a number of facts about this that unfortunately isn't coming through in a lot of the way it's being covered, because it is being perceived in the way that was feared, that somehow this means that we're on the trajectory towards a united Ireland. The numbers haven't substantially changed here at all in this election.
Interesting, because so much of the focus has been on where the DUP seats have gone, where the DUP votes have gone. But actually, if the SDLP, if that nationalist party has crashed so much, that's a very different prospect. Emma, in your view, are we going to see a Sinn Féin First Minister? Does there need to be a political agreement for that to take place?
Well, we have a mandatory coalition system, so Sinn Féin cannot go in without the agreement of the other parties, particularly the DUP. But the big problem here, though, Tom, is rather than the Sinn Féin First Minister position, because that's a First Minister, Deputy First Minister is a joint office, there's a symbolism for that. Of course, unionism should have wanted to avoid that. They should have heeded the warnings. They didn't. They fractured. But ultimately, the biggest problem here is that Sir Jeffrey Donaldson has said he is not going back into power sharing anyway unless there is movement in relation to the protocol. So it actually is the protocol that is causing there to be no restoration of the institutions, and that's the message that he will be sending very clearly to London. Although the DUP lost votes, the DUP and TUV bloc, so the DUP lost to the TUV, but that overall percentage and number is exactly what Sinn Féin got. So, we're talking here about two very, very distinct designations, two distinct groups, but Jeffrey Donaldson will be saying that he has a mandate very clearly around opposing the protocol and asking the British government to do something about that.
Well, let's see how the British government will respond to that. It's a tricky situation, and of course a negotiated solution is what the British government is seeking, although that does seem pretty far away. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme there, but Emma Little-Pengelly, former DUP MP, of course, thanks so much for talking us through that really important issue affecting our country. Thank you. Well, that's it for the programme today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christie's and Mercy Muroki. I'll be back, of course, tomorrow morning at 9:30. And remember, tomorrow is the Queen's speech, Parliament returning. What will be in that? We've got an exciting show for you tomorrow, so stick around for that. But first, before all of that, it's the weather forecast.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking dry and bright for England and Wales, but sadly wet for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Let's take a look at the details. After a bright start this morning, cloud will begin to increase around lunchtime across the southwest. It will be dry though, with temperatures climbing into those high teens. Moving east, and they'll be hanging on to the sunshine across the southeast and East Anglia. It'll be feeling warm with just